Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Shattered relations. The visit of U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to Moscow was nothing less than a disaster. Russia-U.S. relations are now at rock bottom, and Syria is the center of all this. Pessimism is fully warranted. CrossTalking Russia-U.S. relations. I'm joined by my guest, Jonathan Steele, in London. He is an international affairs commentator. In Washington, we have Gareth Porter. He is an independent investigative journalist and historian, as well as author of Manufactured Crisis, the untold story of the Iran nuclear scare. And in Erbil, we cross to Joe Lauria. He is an independent journalist. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Gareth, let me go to you first in Washington, D.C. After the election, there was a highly anticipated meeting of Russian and American officials. Well, it happened, but back at the election time, it was about optimism. In the city where I'm right now, there's an enormous amount of pessimism. The relationship between these two countries is indeed rock bottom. You could see it from the press conference from Tillerson and Lavrov. How do you interpret all of this, and how do we move forward? Go ahead, Gareth.
Well, my interpretation is, if anything, far more pessimistic than your pessimistic introduction.
Wow.
Because it seems to me this is the most dangerous moment that the world has faced for many years, and this is despite a very dangerous world that we've been living in for years and years, and that's because we've had this sudden lurch by the Trump administration. Apparently under the influence of James Mattis, and who's the Secretary of Defense, and the CENTCOM commander, Votel. These people have apparently been steering the White House in the direction of a much harder line on Syria, which takes the form of the use of force in a way that is highly provocative.
Yes. In
circumstances where, the excuse, the rationale for it, of course, the Syrian chemical weapons attack is highly murky, highly debatable who is responsible for it, to say the least. And furthermore, I think the circumstance which makes it most dangerous of all is that there was, in fact, a clear communication by the Russians to the United States military in Syria, warning them ahead of time about this strike. The U.S. was not surprised. They are acting as though they were.
Okay, Joe, when Tillerson was coming to Moscow, we heard from the political establishment in Washington, the blob, as President Obama called it, that it is basically drawing a line. Russia has to walk away from Syria and its relationship with President Assad, or else. I mean, what kind of diplomacy is that? And anyone that has been studying this horrific conflict for all these years know that's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, again, creating a red line without negotiations, no investigation into this chemical incident, because that's what I call it, an incident. We don't know if it was a false flag or not. And you know what? It very well could have been. Go ahead, Joe.
No, this is obviously not diplomacy, or it's American-style diplomacy. It's interesting, former UN Secretary General Boutros-Ghali in his memoir wrote that he thought America would use diplomacy, and he discovered that they had no idea what it was, like the Romans. This is extremely dangerous, but I think the thinking behind this in the blob is that Russia will back down. And of course, that is extremely dangerous position to take, because everything we've seen so far is that Russia will not back down, not on Syria. They let Libya go. They let other interventions by the U.S. go. And as Prime Minister Lavrov lectured Tillerson in that press conference you referenced on history, recent history, and even embarrassed him by saying he had no interest in history. So he was saying to Tillerson and everyone listening that Russia will no longer tolerate this type of chaos that's intentionally being wrought around the region by the United States, and that Syria is where we'll stop. But I don't know if they're listening or they can hear in Washington. This is the problem. They listen to their own rhetoric. I don't think they actually listen to what Russia is telling them, and if they do, they dismiss it immediately. I agree with you that this is an incident, and it has got to have been investigated, and the ploy by the U.S. and Britain and France at the UN Security Council in putting forward a resolution that called for an investigation that puts most of the onus on the Arab Syrian government and not on the rebels who may have been responsible, may have not, we don't know, that Russia had to veto that resolution, but it was set up to make it look like to the world that Russia doesn't want this investigated because they have something to hide, and it's working. People here and even here in Iraq are telling me, why did Russia veto that resolution? I try to explain, but it's very difficult to explain that. By saying from the very beginning, from the first day, that this was the responsibility of Damascus, and repeating that, it can go on. 2 months from now, we may get the results of the OPCW or UN investigation. They might say something very different, that it was actually a bombing of a depot, etc. But no one will believe it or understand it then, because it's been drummed into them that this is Damascus's guilt.
Okay. Jonathan, I was really surprised by the demands being made because just as Joe Lauria just said there's no indication, realistic indication, that Russia is going to change its policy vis-a-vis Syria. Why would the Americans think that it was even a worthwhile talking point? Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, because they want to put the blame for everything happening in Syria on Assad. And so to try and describe him, as Trump did, in this disgustingly crude way, as an animal or a butcher, is really part of this game. And it's, as you say, it's completely unrealistic. Lavrov was quite correct in trying to remind Tillerson at the press conference of recent history, saying, you know, what are you going to do? You've got an obsession with toppling leaders, but then look what happened in Iraq. Look what happened in Libya. He even mentioned Kosovo. He even mentioned Sudan when the Americans put pressure on Omar al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, to let South Sudan break away. And now look at the chaos in South Sudan at the moment.
So, Gareth, one of the things that, in watching the American talk shows and in the UK, the people that support intervention in Syria, they can't really get their story right. What do they want to do? Get rid of Assad, get rid of ISIS, get rid of terrorist groups? They never really can answer the question, because really what they want is their own way, okay? That's what they want. They want to, they think they can do it simultaneously. We need to point out to our viewers, the single most important military power fighting ISIS in Syria today is the Syrian Arab Army. But, Western audiences are never told that. Go ahead, Gareth.
Well, look, I think this is a more complicated story that we're looking at with regard to the Trump administration's calculus. There's no doubt that the military advisors to the president have a calculus. They have a strategy which they're satisfied with, and I think part of it is that they are using the bluster and the use of force over Syria to try to scare the Chinese into taking a very aggressive position toward North Korea. I believe that this Trump administration regards North Korea as the real threatening issue of the future. They are determined to somehow prevail over North Korea in terms of its nuclear program, and they see the Chinese as their last best hope, other than using military force, which they know would be a terrible idea, an awful option. So there's no doubt that they viewed the use of force in Syria as a way of sending a message to China in the hope that they could mobilize China on their behalf to put pressure on North Korea. And then the second thing that I think is happening with the Trump administration is that they understood this as their main opportunity to get out from under the enormous political pressures coming from the news media and the Democratic Party on the idea that he is a tool of the Putin government.
Okay, Joe, so Gareth just mentioned there in North Korea, we have Syria, we have a nuclear-armed Russia, we have a next door to Syria, we have Iran that has made it very clear that there will not be forced regime change in Damascus, and all this is all being done to posture and show another country about its perseverance on the world stage to save the Trump presidency. This is really a big gamble. I'm sorry, Gareth. Now I'm even more pessimistic than you are. Go ahead, Joe.
Maybe we should start saying our prayers after that litany of dangerous situations you just mentioned. It's funny that we finally mentioned the word Trump in this broadcast.
Okay.
And we didn't even mention him. Gareth just talked about the Trump administration. Where is Trump in this? I agree, and I said on the first day that this was a symbolic cruise missile attack by Trump to get his critics off his back. And in fact, they're going to dig in even deeper and demand more things from him.
Yep.
He's really becoming immediately irrelevant, perhaps. And that's anybody who pinned their hopes on him before the election, and that included a lot of people in Moscow, I have forgotten about this immediately. This has changed all of that. So where does Trump stand in all this? Can he still stand up to these guys? Did he ever mean what he said in the campaign? We really don't know, but I mean, it's really not something you could pin a lot of hopes on that he's going to be able to stand up to these guys. It looks like that the blob has won already. Yeah. Now we're in a new phase so quickly, and how does this play out? And it's interesting about China, because where was the Chinese president at the moment that those cruise missiles were fired? There was no question that that was a signal to China as well. How will China respond to that? They look like they may be getting tougher with North Korea, and some news that's coming out. So I don't know if that's part of the game. I don't think that's the whole thing. And we have an administration also, by the way, Peter, like Sean Spicer is all over the map with what he's saying.
Yeah.
I don't know how important he is in all of this, but he is speaking for the president. At one point he said we want to destabilize Syria.
I think that was definitely his worst day so far, but he does reflect the truth. Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Russia-U.S. relations. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lamel. To remind you, we're discussing Russia-U.S. relations. Okay, Jonathan, if I can go back to you in London, let's take on the one hand the Tillerson-Lavrov press conference, and then go back to what Joe was talking about when President Trump ordered the Tomahawks to be fired at Syria. And you have the president of China sitting next to you. He remembers that chocolate cake remarkably well. But what the outcome of that is that in Moscow, with the press conference, there was zero trust there. I mean, there was more trust during the Cold War, because I remember it, okay? And then you have a Chinese guest kind of boxed in there. You don't want to be rude. A protocol is very important. But trust is also being tested here, is because here he is visiting the United States on a state visit, and Trump illegally attacks a country that has not threatened the United States. It is a gross violation of international law. So you have these two major countries, Russia and China, looking at a country that is not reliable. I mean, and then you have to take the personal temperament of Donald Trump here. I mean, this is not, there's nothing to be optimistic about this, okay? I'm tired of the 100 days. This is something that is very, very serious. Again, if it's just to prove a point at home, this is proving a cheap point in very dangerous circumstances. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, I would slightly dissent from the excessive pessimism that you've been talking about and your description at the very beginning that the meeting in Moscow was a disaster. I mean, of course there's disappointment. People had thought there would be more sensible relations than there were under the Obama administration. But all we've done, I think, basically is go back to Obama. I don't think it's worse than that. I don't think it's worse than the Cold War. There was some progress, let's face it, in Moscow. They reinstated the deconfliction arrangements whereby the two air forces in Syria, the Russian and the American, will now go back to informing each other in advance of their flight plans, so there's no risk of collision. There's also, they set up a special group between the Russians and the Americans to discuss all the various bilateral issues and the international ones. They did reconfirm, I mean, the Americans reconfirmed that the military priority in Syria is still the fight against IS. So there were some small signs forward. And I think, you know, one must get away from some of this media shouting by all the media that everything is a disaster and we're going down the hill. And, you know, diplomacy is a slow process. We're not on the brink of World War III. The sensible heads will return, I think, and we shouldn't be too pessimistic.
I'm afraid I disagree.
Can I jump in here,
Yeah,
Peter?
because I
know you disagree, but
okay,
I'm entitled to disagree with you, Peter, sometimes.
Okay, yeah, and you do almost every time you come on, and that's good.
I try to. That's why I come on. Okay. I like to answer the question rather than let you answer your own question.
All right, fine. Okay, Gareth, you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a very important interview that Stephen Cohen, the Russian specialist whose interviews are published regularly in The Nation magazine, has just put out, in which he talks about the danger that now faces us with regard to Syria and Russian-U.S. relations, which is that the Russians are now saying, they have said publicly, that they are seriously considering their own no-fly zone. In other words, protecting the Syrian Air Force because of the threat from the United States that it might use Tomahawk missiles again against the Syrian Air Force or bases which they've used. Now, you know, this is an imprecise counter threat, but there's no reason to believe that it is an idle threat because they have to take into account their options with regard to what they would do if the United States were to repeat this. So I think this is one of the very serious dangers that we face with regard to the downside, the extreme downside of what the Trump administration has done here. And let me just go back to the incident, as you called it. And the evidence suggests to me, and I've just written a piece which will be published today about this, that this is probably a repeat of the false flag attack that appears to have occurred with regard to the aid convoy last September.
Okay.
Where the white helmets basically lied about this and that it was, in fact, a ground attack, not an air attack.
Okay, Joe, I'm glad that Gareth brought up that attack back in September, because there was a movement, I think a lot of us had a little bit of optimism, and that there would be some kind of ceasefire that the United States and Russia had brokered, would stand by. And of course, Ash Carter destroyed it all. Oops, he says it was a mistake. I think all of us know it wasn't. And the last attack that we had, the Tomahawks here, we had the peace process going on in Kazakhstan that was going someplace. Okay, every time we get to a point where something, peace might break out, the horror of it, okay, then we have an incident here. And that's why I will disagree with Jonathan, is that, it's always about military solutions, military options here. I don't see this administration talking about negotiations, talking about getting everyone around the table. All they want to do is, first they want to get rid of ISIS, and oh, by the way, we're going to get rid of Assad again. That's back on the radar. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I think the West has to ask themselves, Western leaders, journalists, and the Western public, to the extent that they're informed, who do they want to be in charge of Syria? There's only really two choices. Yes, there are unarmed civilians who have protested and still want to see Assad go. And there are so-called moderate rebels. But the major forces are now Islamic State and al-Nusra and affiliated groups. Do you want them to take over in Damascus, or do you want Bashar al-Assad, who admittedly is not the greatest Democrat in the world? His entire family's been ruling for 40 years. But this is a man who's never threatened the West. He has not even threatened Israel. He's been just talking, and nobody in this region where I am has ever believed the word he ever said against Israel. He's not a threat to anybody, to his neighbors. And yet you have the Islamic State that has already attacked in Brussels and in Paris and in Berlin and San Bernardino. They are a threat. And why, in any way, would the U.S. want to risk those guys getting into power? We know from the leaked conversation of John Kerry last September to Syrian exiles in New York that the U.S. was watching ISIS move towards the towards Damascus, and they wanted him to put pressure on Assad so that he would step down. They were willing to risk ISIS taking over. This is insanity, and I think that it has to be focused on what's going on in Syria, that they cannot allow these extremists who are a threat to everyone in the West and in Russia to even come close to coming to power. And this is what we see is going to happen if the United States intervenes against the Syrian regime. And Donald Trump, as a candidate, completely understood this and explicitly said this, that the problem was ISIS, and then we'd have an election and let the Syrian people decide. It was the same position Russia had. What happened, is something that will probably be written about a long time from now, exactly how that change happened, but it has brought us to this point now.
Okay, Jonathan, if I could take a feather from your optimism, let's go back to the press conference that Lavrov and Tillerson had. I said in my introduction that the relations had hit rock bottom. The only upside of hitting the rock bottom is that you could only really go in one direction, and that is up. Do you think that this was kind of like to break the ice and to get things moving again, kind of admitting we've hit this brick wall? Both countries are very steadfast in their positions. And again, to go back to something that you said, is to start the very slow process here. Maybe Trump has got the Russia gate off his back finally, and he can actually start doing something. Just a theory. Go ahead, Jonathan.
No, I agree with you and the other speakers that the American deep state, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, what we now tend to call deep state, of the top military brass, the arms manufacturers and the spy agencies working together to undermine Trump's initial instincts and to get him back into traditional war-fighting mode, which we saw under the Democrats and under George Bush, the Republican, and now we're back to the same thing again. But what I was trying to say, I don't think it's got worse. It could now get a little bit better. I mean, the important point about the press conference was that the Russians stood firm. They asked the crucial question, which George has just also mentioned, what happens after Assad? Are you really going to allow Islamists to take over? Is it going to be Iraq all over again? You can't just decapitate a regime. If you try and dismantle the Syrian army, where are they going to go? Half the people who are fighting for IS are former Ba'athist commanders from Saddam Hussein. They're not all Islamists. They're ex-Baathists. And the same thing could happen in Syria if Assad collapses.
Gareth, are we going to see? Have we seen Trump morph into Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama on this? I mean, because the precedent has been set. Okay, he is illegally attacked Syria. Now people can get used to it, because I really worry that the deep state, since it's been mentioned, they're going to tap him on the shoulder and say, "Mr. President, it's time to do it again." I mean, this is one could make this claim here, and it looks pretty simple, because usually the simplest answer is the right answer. Go ahead, Gareth.
Peter, I think that Trump has, in fact, morphed into Hillary Clinton, to put it in terms of those personalities. And that means, in fact, that the deep state, as Jonathan has just termed it, has, in fact, won. I mean, the blob has won. I think that Trump is simply incapable of standing up to them. And that's why I think that the situation in this administration is, in fact, much worse than it was under Obama. Obama was a weak president.
Yep.
No question about it. He failed to stand up to the blob on a number of occasions, on Iraq, on Afghanistan, and to some extent on Syria. But he did, in fact, stand up to them when it counted in 2013, when he refused ultimately to carry out the Tomahawk strike. Although at that point, the Joint Chiefs were really not that eager, or at least the Army was not that eager to have that strike take place. So it's not clear how much pressure was brought from that quarter. I think it was more generally the political pressure from the news media and the national security elite generally. But my problem here is that I think that Trump is simply a non-entity in terms of his ability to reason on these issues. Obama did, in fact, have very strong ideas. He simply was unwilling in the end to stand up to the pressure that he got on Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think Trump is immeasurably worse because he's such a weak,
we used the word pessimism on this program too many times. We've run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, London, and in Erbil. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
believes that this will not be I love you.